Ever find yourself just like totally wiped after a workout? Muscles are burning, That, my friend, is your circulatory system working overtime.
Mm.
And today we're going to dive deep into how it all works. We're talking blood vessels, pressure flow, resistance, all that good stuff that keeps you going.
It really is an incredible system, you know? It delivers nutrients and oxygen to every single cell in your body, while also, like, whisking away the waste. It's like a nonstop delivery and sanitation service all happening inside you right now.
And to guide us through this deep dive, we have some insights from a physiology expert, Dr. Rasha Eldeeb.
Yeah, Dr. Eldeeb breaks down the circulatory system into, like, three key principles. First, blood flow to each tissue is controlled based on its needs. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
So like when I'm sprinting for the bus, my leg muscles are getting way more blood than, say, my toes.
Exactly. Your body prioritizes blood flow to where it's needed most. The second principle is that cardiac output, which is the total amount of blood your heart pumps per minute, is determined by the sum of all those local tissue flows.
So it's like a budgeting system for blood flow, making sure everything gets what it needs.
Precisely. And the third principle, which might seem a little counterintuitive, is that arterial pressure is managed independently of those other two factors.
Wait, hold on. If my heart is pumping more blood to my muscles during exercise, wouldn't my blood pressure have to go up too?
You'd think so, right? But if arterial pressure were solely determined by blood flow or cardiac output, it could fluctuate like wildly. Instead, your body has separate mechanisms to, fine-tune that arterial pressure, ensuring a consistent blood supply to all tissues even when demands change.
So it's like having a pressure regulator that keeps things stable even when the system is under stress. Pretty smart.
Exactly. Now let's break down the three key players that Dr. Eldeeb highlights: pressure, flow, and resistance. And believe it or not, we can use an analogy from the world of electricity to understand how they relate. Remember Ohm's law?
Vaguely. There's something about volts, amps, and ohms, right? It's been a while since high school physics.
Well, think of it this way. Replace current with blood flow, voltage, with the pressure difference between 2 points, and resistance with vascular resistance. Suddenly, we're talking about the circulatory system.
Okay, so the bigger the pressure difference, the more blood flows. And the higher the resistance, the less blood flows. That makes sense.
Exactly. Now let's talk about how we actually measure blood flow. Luckily, we have non-invasive ways to do this, like Doppler ultrasound.
Oh, like they use during pregnancy to listen to the baby's heartbeat.
That's right. It uses sound waves to measure the velocity of blood flow, giving doctors a window into how well the circulatory system is working. Speaking of flow, did you know that blood doesn't just move smoothly through your vessels like water through a pipe? There are actually two types of flow, laminar and turbulent.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me.
Imagine a calm river flowing smoothly in parallel layers. That's laminar flow. Now picture a section of rapids where the water is like churning and mixing chaotically. That's turbulent flow.
So turbulent flow sounds like a bad thing, right? Like something's gone wrong.
Well, it depends on the context. It can actually be normal in larger arteries where blood flow is naturally more turbulent. But in smaller vessels, or if there's something obstructing the flow, like plaque buildup in the arteries, turbulent flow can be a sign of trouble. And get this, doctors can actually hear turbulent flow using a stethoscope.
No way. So a stethoscope isn't just for listening to heartbeats.
Nope. The chaotic movement of blood in turbulent flow creates distinct sounds that a trained ear can pick up. It's another tool in the doctor's kit for assessing cardiovascular health.
That's amazing. I'm starting to realize how much is going on beneath the surface. So we've talked about pressure and flow, but what about the actual speed of blood as it travels through the circulatory system?
That's a great question. It turns out that blood flow velocity, meaning how fast the blood is moving, varies dramatically depending on the type of blood vessel. Here's a fascinating fact. Blood moves slowest in the capillaries, those tiny blood vessels where nutrient and waste exchange happens.
Wait, really? You'd think it would have to move quickly to deliver all that oxygen and nutrients efficiently.
It's counterintuitive, I know, but there's a reason for it. The slow velocity in the capillaries allows for more contact time between the blood and the surrounding tissues. Think of it like a delivery truck slowing down to make sure every package gets dropped off at the right address. This maximizes the exchange of oxygen, nutrients, and waste products.
So it's about efficiency, not speed. Makes sense.
Exactly. And before we had fancy imaging techniques, doctors used to estimate blood flow velocity using some pretty interesting methods. One involved injecting a substance into an arm vein and timing how long it took for someone to taste it on their tongue.
Seriously, that's how they measured blood flow, just waiting for someone to say, yep, I taste it.
It sounds a bit crude now, but it was actually a clever way to get a rough idea of how efficiently the heart was pumping blood. They also had a similar method using ether, where they'd time how long it took for the smell to reach the lungs.
I can't help but picture those early experiments.
Uh,
Okay, John, take a deep breath. Anything yet? No. All right, another sniff. There's the ether. Quick, write down the time. I'm glad we have more precise methods now.
Me too. Now let's move on to the concept of resistance. Resistance is basically anything that hinders blood flow in a vessel.
So like if there's plaque buildup in an artery, that would increase resistance.
Exactly. And although we can't measure resistance directly, we can calculate it using blood flow and pressure difference measurements. And the unit we use for that is PRU, or peripheral resistance unit.
Okay, PRU, got it. But what factors actually determine resistance?
Two main factors come into play: vessel radius and blood viscosity. Vessel radius, meaning the diameter of the blood vessel, has a massive impact on resistance. Even tiny changes in radius can cause significant changes in blood flow. This relationship is described by Poiseuille's law, which admittedly involves a bit of math.
Okay, let's try to keep the math to a minimum.
Fair enough. The key takeaway is that the relationship between vessel radius and blood flow is exponential. So if the radius of a blood vessel doubles, blood flow doesn't just double, it increases by a factor of 16.
Whoa, that's a huge difference. So even a slight narrowing of an artery due to plaque buildup can significantly restrict blood flow.
Exactly, and that's why keeping your arteries healthy is crucial for maintaining good circulation. Now, let's talk about the other factor influencing resistance: blood viscosity. Viscosity refers to the thickness of the blood, and it's primarily determined by the concentration of red blood cells, which is known as hematocrit.
So the higher the hematocrit, the thicker the blood, and the harder it is for the heart to pump.
Precisely. Think of it like honey versus water. Honey flows much slower than water because it's more viscous. The same principle applies to blood. An extreme example is a condition called polycythemia, where the body produces too many red blood cells, making the blood incredibly thick and difficult to pump.
That sounds serious. So keeping our blood viscosity within a healthy range is important for efficient circulation.
Absolutely. It's all about maintaining that delicate balance for optimal flow. And speaking of balance, let's talk about the driving force behind it all: pressure.
Okay, bring on the pressure. I'm ready to understand what makes this whole system tick.
Okay.
All right, pressure. It's a word we hear all the time, but what does it actually mean in the context of our circulatory system?
Well, in simple terms, blood pressure is the force exerted by the blood against the walls of your blood vessels. Think of it like water flowing through a hose. The pressure of the water pushing against the inside of the hose is like blood pressure.
And we measure blood pressure using that inflatable cuff at the doctor's office. Right?
Yeah, that's the sphygma manometer. It gives us two numbers: systolic pressure, which is the pressure when your heart beats, and diastolic pressure, which is the pressure when your heart rests between beats. But there's another pressure concept that's important to understand called critical closing pressure.
Critical closing pressure. That sounds a bit ominous. What's that all about?
It's actually a fascinating phenomenon. Critical closing pressure is the pressure at which blood flow through a vessel stops, even though there's still some pressure present.
Wait, how is that possible? I thought if there's pressure, there's flow.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But remember those tissues surrounding your blood vessels? They exert pressure too. When the pressure inside the blood vessel, called intraluminal pressure, drops below the pressure exerted by the surrounding tissues, the vessel collapses, stopping the flow.
So it's like a tug of war between the blood pressure and the pressure from the surrounding tissues. And sometimes the tissues actually win.
Exactly. And this can happen for a few reasons, like a decrease in blood pressure, an increase in tissue pressure, or even constriction of those tiny muscles controlling blood flow through capillaries. It's a delicate balancing act.
Okay, so the relationship between pressure and flow isn't always a simple one. What else do we need to consider?
Well, another factor is the distensibility of blood vessels, meaning their ability to expand and contract.
So like how a balloon can stretch and shrink depending on how much air is inside.
That's a great analogy. This elasticity is crucial for several reasons. For one, it helps blood vessels handle the surges of blood from your heartbeat. When your heart pumps, the arteries expand to accommodate the extra blood, then recoil to help push the blood forward.
So it's like a built-in shock absorber for the circulatory system, smoothing out the flow.
Exactly. This distensibility also plays a key role in regulating blood flow. Your sympathetic nervous system, that's the fight or flight response system, can cause blood vessels to constrict or dilate, changing blood flow to different parts of the body as needed.
So if I'm about to give a presentation and my heart is racing, My sympathetic nervous system is probably constricting blood vessels to my digestive system and sending more blood to my brain and muscles.
You got it. It's a dynamic system constantly adjusting to keep you functioning at your best.
This is also fascinating. We've covered pressure, flow, resistance, and now distensibility. Is there anything else we should know about how our blood vessels handle this complex dance?
There are two more key concepts to explore: vascular compliance and the law of Laplace.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's vascular compliance?
Vascular compliance, sometimes called vascular capacitance, is a measure of how much blood a particular part of the circulatory system can hold for a given change in pressure.
So it's like the storage capacity of a blood vessel.
Exactly. And veins, the blood vessels carrying blood back to the heart, have the highest compliance. They're like the blood storage tanks of the circulatory system, holding a large volume of blood without a significant increase in pressure.
So our veins are basically the body's reserve blood bank.
Interesting. Now, what about the law of Laplace? That sounds a bit intimidating.
It might sound complicated, but it's actually a pretty elegant principle that explains the relationship between tension in the wall of a blood vessel, the pressure inside the vessel, and the radius of the vessel.
Okay, break it down for me. I'm picturing a complicated physics equation.
Let's keep it simple. Imagine blowing up a balloon. The more air you blow in, the greater the pressure inside, and the tighter the rubber becomes, right?
Yeah, I can see that.
Well, the law of Laplace tells us that the tension in the wall of the balloon or a blood vessel is proportional to the pressure inside multiplied by the radius. So if the pressure stays the same, a larger balloon will have more tension in its wall than a smaller one.
Okay, that makes sense. But how does this apply to our blood vessels? It has several important implications. For starters, it helps explain why capillaries, those tiny blood vessels, are so strong despite their thin walls. Because their radius is so small, the tension in their walls is relatively low, even though they're carrying blood under pressure.
So their small size actually makes them more resilient. That's counterintuitive.
It is. The law of Laplace also explains why dilation of the heart, which increases its radius, makes it work harder. A larger heart needs to generate more tension in its walls to produce the same pressure, requiring more energy. This is relevant to athletes' hearts, which are often larger but also more efficient due to training adaptations.
So having a larger heart isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if it's developed through exercise.
Exactly. And finally, the law of Laplace even applies to our lungs. It helps explain why surfactant, a substance that reduces surface tension, is crucial for preventing the tiny air sacs in our lungs called alveoli from collapsing.
Wow, this one law governs blood flow in our tiniest blood vessels, our powerful heart, and even our lungs. Talk about multitasking. Is there anything else we should know about how blood flow works on a physical level?
There's one more principle that's important to understand: Bernoulli's principle.
Okay, let's hear it.
Bernoulli's principle describes how the energy of a fluid like blood changes as it flows through a vessel. It states that the total energy of the fluid remains constant, but the forms of energy might shift.
Okay, give me an example.
Think of a roller coaster. It has more potential energy at the top of the hill and more kinetic energy as it speeds down, but the total energy remains the same.
I see. So it's about the conversion between different forms of energy.
Exactly. And in the case of blood flow, Bernoulli's principle tells us that as the speed of blood increases, the pressure must decrease to maintain a constant total energy. This principle helps explain how changes in blood vessel diameter affect both blood flow velocity and pressure.
So it's like a constant energy trade-off happening within our blood vessels. That's incredible. It's amazing how our bodies can orchestrate all these complex processes at the same time.
It really is. And it all comes down to the interplay of those three key players we talked about earlier: pressure, flow, and resistance. They're the stars of the circulatory show.
And they're not just static players, they're constantly adapting and responding to the body's needs. This has been a whirlwind tour of circulatory system basics. What are the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with today?
So we look at the circulatory system's main goal, which is like keeping everything running smoothly for our cells, right? Delivering nutrients, removing waste, all that jazz.
Yep, and we saw how it all works based on those three key principles. Blood flow based on need, cardiac output from all those individual flows, and then arterial pressure kind of doing its own thing.
We saw how pressure, flow, and resistance are all linked together, kind of like those electrical terms: volts, amps, and ohms. It all connects. Oh, yeah, and don't forget about those different kinds of flow: laminar and turbulent. One's like a calm river, the other's whitewater rapids.
I was blown away that doctors can hear that turbulent flow using a stethoscope.
Yeah, stethoscopes can do way more than just listen to heartbeats.
And who knew that blood flow actually slows down in those tiny capillaries.
Mhm.
I thought it'd be like a super highway in there.
Right. It's like a delivery truck slowing down to make sure every package gets to the right place.
That's a good way to think about it. Then we had resistance, kind of an obstacle course for the blood.
And we found out that even small changes in vessel size can make a huge difference in how easily blood flows.
That Poiseuille's law, it was a lot to take in, but the takeaway was clear. Then we had to talk about the thickness of blood, the viscosity.
Thicker blood means the heart has to work harder, kind of like trying to pump honey instead of water.
That brings us back to pressure, the force that drives it all.
We even touched on that critical closing pressure where flow can stop even if there's pressure present.
It's like a constant balancing act going on inside our bodies.
Then we had distensibility, the amazing ability of our blood vessels to expand and contract.
It's like our blood vessels have their own built-in shock absorbers. Plus, it helps regulate that blood flow.
And vascular compliance, think of it like the storage capacity of our blood vessels, with the veins acting as those reserve tanks.
And remember that law of Laplace. It sounded intimidating at first, but it actually explains a lot about tension, pressure, and radius in our circulatory system.
It even explains things in the heart and lungs. Our body systems are so interconnected.
And just when we thought we had it all figured out, we got to Bernoulli's principle.
It's all about those energy shifts as blood flows, kind of like a roller coaster going up and down the hills.
It's mind-blowing how our bodies handle all these complex processes all at once.
It really is, and it all comes down to the interplay of pressure flow and resistance.
So after all that, what's the main point you want our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway is just how incredible and dynamic our circulatory system is.
It's working tirelessly in the background to keep us going.
And by understanding how it all works, we can make better choices to keep it healthy.
This deep dive has been a fascinating reminder of how amazing our bodies truly are.
Absolutely.
Well, that concludes our exploration of pressure flow and resistance in the circulatory system.
We hope you learned a lot and maybe even got inspired to take even better care of your own health.
Until next time, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.